Hey everyone, welcome to our first official day of the semester in short fiction. Woo. In this video, I wanted to go over two main points. One, under the resources tab on week one, I've uploaded a document that is entitled On Short Fiction or Why We Read and Write Stories. And this is a sort of review of the three essays that I asked you to read initially: The Psychological Comforts of Storytelling, On Writing Stories by Flannery O'Connor, and the essay that gives you kind of like a brief history dating from the 19th century on of the American short story and its evolution. In it, I just kind of highlight some of the main points from those essays to make it a little bit easier for you all to digest. And I also really kind of explore and go into a little bit more detail about why we tell stories. What are the functions of telling, sharing, circulate stories? So I want you to review that document first, and then move on to your readings of Hemingway and Grace Paley, which we'll be discussing for the remainder of this particular week. That will be our first official discussion forum. Also, if you haven't already done so, please take a moment and go to our forums and introduce yourself. Some of you already have. Thank you. We've been able to say hi. If you haven't done that yet, please make sure that you do that before the end of this week, and preferably in the next day or so while we're all getting situated. It'll give you a chance to sort of see how our discussion forums will ultimately function, which will be good practice before you hit the Paley Hemingway official discussion forum. I also wanted to kind of just verbally talk you through another document that's posted under the resources tab for week one, which is Common Features of a Short Story. You should review this on your own, but I wanted to just highlight some of the terms. This is a good sort of lexicon that we'll be using of these key terms that we'll be utilizing throughout the course of the semester. It's a good way for me to and none of these terms will really be unfamiliar to many of you. I'm talking about plot or narrative point of view, setting. Of course, you know essentially what these terms mean, but I want to just go into a little bit more detail about them, highlight them for you a little bit so that we're all clear on what these terms actually mean and entail, and what I'm asking of you in my questions to you on our discussion forums, our short writing assignments, and ultimately our longer papers. Okay. And don't mind my dog barking. I've closed the door and she's salty at me that she can't come into the room. So we're going to ignore the barking, okay? Firstly, the narrative perspective or the narrative point of view. Obviously, this is fairly self-explanatory. However, there are different points of view that we should take into consideration. Firstly, you have your first person point of view, which is speaking from an I perspective. Our main character is speaking from their own particular perspective and point of view. This is fairly common in fiction, fairly common in short stories. This gives us sort of VIP access to the main character, so we get their inner thoughts, we learn about their experiences. It helps us often to feel a sense of allegiance to this particular character or sympathy for this particular character. However, if the first-person perspective narrator seems unreliable, which we will see throughout the course of the semester. We'll see it in Poe's A Telltale Heart. We'll see it potentially, arguably, in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, where we have an unreliable narrator, meaning perhaps there's some kind of psychological issue at stake that makes the narrator's perspective or logic or understanding of a situation questionable for us as readers. So that's something to keep in mind. We have a second perspective point of view, which is not very common in fiction. It's more common in nonfiction, but that's writing to a you. We won't deal with that too much. Then you have a third person narration. This is a perspective dealing with a he or a she, right? So we have a third person limited where we have a narrator who is talking about characters that are not obviously the narrator, him or herself. So a he, a she, a Sally, a Bob. And then we have a third person omniscient, which is the same concept where we have a he, a she, a Sally, a Bob, but we also have access to the characters. We also have, like in first person narration, a kind of VIP access to their perspectives, their thoughts, how they are understanding a situation. So we do get access to these characters, even though we don't get it from a first person perspective. Okay, so that's our narrative viewpoint. Then we have the setting of the story, obviously, when and where the story is taking place. This seems totally benign, but actually, as we know, settings can be incredibly important for a story. Settings can provide a certain mood, settings can provide some foreshadowing. Settings sometimes can be a character in and of itself in a story. We will see this arguably in Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown at the end of the semester, where the woods and the wilderness really serves as another sort of primary character in the story, which actually is doing quite a bit of work for Hawthorne as the author. Okay, we have the structure of the plot. The plot obviously is the motivating action of a story. We get typically some kind of opening situation that takes place for one particular character or between characters or a set of characters. There is often a complication at some point, some sort of dilemma that emerges during the story. And then often there is some kind of a resolution. But as we will see with many of the stories that we will read throughout the course of the semester, some of these stories do not end with a kind of tidy, comforting, happy resolution. There may seem to be a resolution, there may be some cliffhangers, we may feel incredibly disturbed or unsettled or confused at the end of some of these stories, and that is sort of how the plot tends to function. It's not something that is static in every story. The plot can be presented in a variety of ways, and every story does not present in a kind of linear fashion, as in this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, and here's the resolution at the end. Sometimes we take a more winding, complicated, backroads path on our way through the plot of a given story. Okay, we have our central character, who's the main character in a particular story, and then we have some supporting characters who help to challenge or illuminate some quality or characteristic or conflict in the story in relation to the main character. And then, of course, we have themes, which are messages that the author is trying to convey. This can come off potentially as a moral. We'll see this a lot in the fairy tales, which we were going to dive into pretty quickly. All of the functions of fairy tales have a moral root to them. This is bad, this is good. There's a teaching element to these fairy tales, which is why now, they weren't originally, but now they are geared towards children because there's a learning aspect to them. There's a message, a hidden message, and sometimes in fairy tales, not a very hidden message, a very overt, clear, this is right, this is wrong, this is bad, this is good, this is light, this is dark. Those sort of binaries are very much at play in fairy tales, for example, and that can be an example of a type of theme. And I'll use the word theme quite a bit, warning, throughout the course of this semester, because we're always going to be trying to extract deeper messages in these stories. We're always going to try to sort of clear the pathway, take out our microscopes, and look for a deeper message or meaning within these particular stories. And they often exist in these stories. We just have to be really good detectives. And then, of course, we have an ending. Again, as I said, sometimes these endings actually do provide a kind of resolution to a conflict in the story. As they do often in fairy tales, the bad often gets punished and the good often sort of is rewarded in some capacity. But this is not, as we will see, always the case. There will be endings that will surprise you, there will be endings that traumatize you. Yes, there will be endings that leave you hanging and wanting more clarification. There will be endings that feel dissatisfactory for a variety of reasons, depending on your own reading experience of these stories. And then you have some stylistic features. What do I mean by that? I mean symbolism, I mean personification, motifs. All of these terms we will unpack and we will be utilizing throughout the course of this semester, again, in order to give us the kind of language that we need to critically unpack and examine these texts. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight those for you since we are going to be using them so much. And again, please make sure that you are introducing yourself on our discussion forum, our first discussion forum, and make sure that you read the document under week 1, under resources, entitled On Short Stories, or Why We Write and Tell Stories, just so that we all are well situated going into this first week and beyond. If you have any questions, if you have any issues working through Sakai, please feel free to reach out to me at any time so I can assist you. And onward. Okay, bye.